or we need to qualify it in light of the fact that in the Theodicy indicates quite explicitly physical pain, physical evil is restricted to rational minds. And so we can't really speak of the dog as suffering physical evil. Maybe we can't even talk of it as having volitions in a full sense. And it might be that Leibniz is here just following Bayle and using Bayle's example, and he'd want to qualify it if he were using it to frame his own position. In any event, Leibniz holds that the sort of appetite involved in a dog's production of its own painful state, and this would hold for rational minds as well, differs from what gives rise to its voluntary action. As he notes in the new essays, this is passage F, there are other efforts arising from insensible perceptions which we are not aware of. I prefer to call these appetitions rather than volitions, for one describes as voluntary only actions that one can be aware of and can reflect upon when they arise from some consideration of the good or bad. Here the emphasis is on the fact that the volition involved in voluntary action differs from the dog's appetite for a painful state, insofar as it is connectable to a consideration of value. More important, however, is the fact that the volition is directed to the production not of the state that's best for the world, as in the case of the mere appetite, but rather of the state that appears to the agent to be the best for it. As we have seen, however, imperfections in a created agent allow it to have volitions that are directed toward what merely appears to be, and in fact is not, the best for it. Since the appetites that produce states involving physical evil are directed toward what is objectively the best, the involvement of God's will in such appetites doesn't seem to compromise his desire to produce the best possible effect. However, the volitions that produce sinful action are directed towards something that is not the best for the agent. To be sure, the moral evils that derive from these volitions are as integral a part of the best of all possible worlds as are the physical evils that derive from mere appetites. Yet even though the volitions produce what is in fact required for the best outcome, they themselves are not directed toward producing an outcome under that description. Insofar as he is entangling himself with such volitions by concurring with them, God appears to be compromising the quality of his action. So it's understandable that it is Leibniz's discussion of moral evil in the Theodicy, and not his discussion of physical evil, that leads him to consider, this is passage G, the physical concurrence of God with the creature, as well as the moral concurrence, which was the more perplexing. But though I hope it's clear by now why the case of moral evil introduces complications for an adequate account of divine concurrence, we'll see that it's at least initially perplexing why Leibniz might have thought that moral concurrence is the more perplexing of the two kinds of concurrence. So section 2, moral concurrence with moral evil. There's an early statement of the problem of God's moral concurrence with moral evil in a text dating from around 1670 on the omnipotence and omniscience of God and the freedom of man. In this text, Leibniz asks rhetorically, this is passage H, who could even have denied that it stood within God's power to banish all sins from the world, that he did not do this, ergo, he wants the sins to remain. This early writing offers no solution to this problem. Indeed, after presenting various difficulties, the text itself ends in mid-sentence with, but we, damit, aber wir. That's it. However, Leibniz does attempt to offer a solution to this problem in the Theodicy. Some of his comments in this text seem to suggest that the solution is relatively straightforward. Leibniz indicates that those who permit sins they could have prevented are often morally culpable for them, yet he adds that this is not the case if they would be failing in some duty in acting to prevent the sins. In fact, if God acted to prevent sins, he would be failing in his duty to create the best of all possible worlds. For without the sins they contain, the world would not in fact be the best possible world. Thus, it's God's moral duty to refrain from preventing sins that created agents actually commit. So what are we to make of Leibniz's claim that among the difficulties concerning God's concurrence with moral evil, this passage I, the greatest of these lies in maintaining that God concurs morally in moral evil, that is, in sin, without being the originator of sin, and even without being accessory thereto. Given Leibniz's view that both the actual world, with every one of its sins, is the best possible, and that God has a moral duty to create the best possible world, there seems to be no great difficulty in allowing that God is justified in refraining from preventing the occurrence of the sins that are present in the actual world. So isn't Bob Slay correct, and perhaps even understating the case, in claiming that, this is Bob's claim, there's some hyperbole in Leibniz's claim that the problem of divine moral concurrence in sin is the most difficult to resolve. In fact, there's more to the case of God's moral concurrence with moral evil, and what more there is can go some ways towards explaining why Leibniz found this sort of concurrence to be perplexing. So let's start with the indication in Leibniz's essay from the 1670s that the real problem with God's moral concurrence is that it seems to require that, as Leibniz puts it, he wants the sins to remain. I believe that this concern motivates Leibniz's later emphasis in the Theodicy, which I've noted, that God merely permits and does not will moral evil. In the preface to this text, Leibniz flags this issue when he claims that one of his goals is to, as he puts it, quote, explain how evil has a source other than the will of God, and that one is right, therefore, to say of moral evil that God does not will it, but simply permits it, end quote. And in the text itself, this is passage J, he insists that in the case of sinful action, God can will only the permission of it. The crime is neither an end nor a means. It is only a conditio sine qua non. Thus, it is not the object of a direct will, end quote. What God wants in the case of moral evil, then, is not the sin itself, but only the permission of the sin. As I've noted, there seems to be a clear contrast here with the case of physical evil. Further indication of this contrast is provided by Leibniz's claim that whereas God wills moral evil not at all, one may say of physical evil, quote, that God wills it often as a penalty owing to guilt, often also as a means to an end, that is, to prevent greater evils or to obtain greater good, end quote. God can and does will physical evil as a means to an end of producing the best overall effect. But he cannot will sin even as a mere means to the end of producing the best. God can will only the permission of sin, and thus his will, insofar as it, as Leibniz says, has sin for its object, is only permissive, end quote. The point that God merely permits sin goes beyond the point that God is justified in not preventing sins, insofar as they are required for the actual world to be the best possible one. For the latter point seems to hold as well for God's moral concurrence with physical evil. The fact that God has a duty to refrain from preventing physical evil is perfectly consistent with the claim that he wills this evil as a means to the end of creating the best possible world. It is important for Leibniz, however, not only that God have a duty to refrain from preventing sin, but also that he merely permits sin, and so not will it, even just as a means. I think it's fairly clear that the claim that God merely permits and does not will sin is one of the difficulties that Leibniz had in mind with respect to divine moral concurrence with moral evil. And indeed, there seems to be good reason for him to view this delicate distinction between willing as a means and merely permitting to be problematic. In his earlier writings, and this is a passage I think Paul noted earlier, Leibniz, in fact, had some, and I view the passage as problematic in a way Paul might not. So in earlier writings, Leibniz, in fact, had some difficulty explaining permission. So in this text, which is a conversation with Steno concerning freedom, this passage K, Leibniz makes an initial attempt to explain the special relation the divine will bears to sin in terms of, an analogy to the relation of the will of a musician to dissonance. There he notes that a musician wills dissonances only per accidens, quote, that is, he permits them rather than wills them, end quote, since he, quote, would rather avoid them readily if the perfection of the melody allowed, but nonetheless permits them, because by its occurrence, a greater perfection exists in the world. End quote. So in the same way, God wills sins per accidens, because he knows that the series will be more perfect with these included and compensated for in marvelous ways. It's not clear, or at least not clear to me, though, that there's a difference between the musician willing per accidens, or permitting the dissonance on the one hand, and his willing the dissonance as a means to the end of the more perfect harmony on the other. Likewise, it's not clear how the claim that God wills sins per accidens is to be distinguished from the claim that he wills them as the means to the end of creating the best possible world. It thus remains unclear how the relation of God's will to moral evil ultimately differs from its relation to physical evil. Even in the Theodicy, Leibniz seems to run roughshod over the distinction between God's permitting and his willing as a means. At one point in this text, for instance, he claims, this is passage L, that when one wills a thing, one wills also in some manner that all that is necessarily attached to it, end quote. But both physical and moral evil seem to follow with at least a hypothetical necessity from God's decision to create a particular world. Thus, God would appear to will both kinds of evil in the same manner. So much, then, for Leibniz's insistence that God merely permits and does not will moral evil. Indeed, Charles Larmor has argued that Leibniz is committed to rejecting any distinction between permitting and willing as a means. Drawing on the passage from the Theodicy I've just quoted, Larmor claims that in Leibniz's view, God is morally constrained by a consequentialism that requires the willing of anything that contributes to the perfection of the best overall effect. God's consequentialist duty requires that he not only permit, but also will anything required to bring about the existence of the best of all possible worlds. I think Larmor's correct in taking Leibniz to be a kind of consequentialist who understands divine creation to be guided by the single end of producing the best possible effect. As Larmor notes, Leibniz differs in this respect from Malebranche, and we talked a little bit about the Malebranche-Leibniz relation. Malebranche, who insists that in the case of creation, God must balance the goal of producing the best effect with the obligations that he owes to his wisdom to act in the simplest manner. However, I do take as serious Leibniz's attempt to distinguish God's willing physical evil as a means to the end of producing the best effect from his merely permitting moral evil insofar as it is a conditio sine qua non for this world to be the best possible. According to Leibniz's view in the Theodicy, God wills everything that is good individually by means of his antecedent will, and wills the best in all goods and physical evils required for the best by means of his consequent will. However, he can morally concur with the moral evils required for the best only by means of his permissive will, as he puts it. If the moral concurrence involved more than God's use of his permissive will, and in particular, if it involved his consequently willing the moral evil as a means, then for Leibniz, God would be at least an accessory to sin, and thus morally culpable for it. With respect to the passage from the Theodicy that Larmor emphasizes, moreover, it must be noted that Leibniz says that God only in some manner wills all particular effects of his act of creation. In fact, Leibniz indicates in this text that God wills sin only in the sense that he wills to permit sin, and not in the sense that he directly wills the sin as a means to the best end. There remains the question of what it could mean for Leibniz to say that God merely permits sin as opposed to willing it as a means. In the Theodicy, Leibniz himself raises this question in a particularly pointed manner when he notes, quote, "But someone will say, why speak you of permitting? Is it not God that doeth the evil and that willeth?" Unquote. That's the Huggard translation. After initially, and maybe we'll get a new version of that passage soon, hopefully. After initially responding to this question by distinguishing various types of will in God, Leibniz returns to, as he puts it, the objection that it is God himself who acts and who affects all that is real in the creature, end quote. It's this objection that, according to Leibniz's previous quoted claim,